webinar on managing the ewe and doe from late pregnancy to weaning the babies. Okay? I haven't really taken time to introduce myself. Those of you in Maryland and maybe surrounding areas might know who I am, but a lot of you folks from other places probably don't know me. My name is Susan Schoenian. I'm a sheep and goat specialist for University of Maryland Extension. I've been with Extension for 23 years, and I've been in my current position for about 9 years. I have a office at a research center called the Western Maryland Research and Education Center. It's right near the Antietam Civil War battlefield, if that gives you any perspective, about 80 miles north of Washington, D.C., which is actually where the University of Maryland College Park campus is located. At our research center, we've been working with small ruminants for the past 7 years. Starting about 5 years ago, we decided to dedicate our pasture resource to a meat goat performance test. So we keep bucks there during the grazing season. We'd like to expand our research program, but right now we basically have the meat goat bucks during the summer grazing season. I wanted to divide these seminars up into logical topics that we could discuss in an hour's time, or 45 minutes time actually. So keep in mind, with the limited time that we're going to be on, we can't go into extreme detail on these topics. So tonight we're going to cover late gestation. Next week it'll be vaccinations. We're going to take a break the following week because we actually have a local meeting here in Washington County, Maryland. And then the following 4 weeks after that we'll have parturition, or basically birthing, neonatal care, how do you take care of the babies, or what are some problems that babies can have, lactation. The lactation webinar is actually going to be done by Jeff Semler. I mentioned his name earlier. Jeff is a county extension agent here in Washington County, Maryland. Originally he is dairy specialist, but he's really a jack of all trade in terms of livestock and crops. The last session is going to be weaning. At first I was thinking, well, how can you spend a whole session on weaning? But really there is a lot of things to talk about, the pros and cons of early versus late weaning, the management at weaning, the management of those lambs and kids at that time. It's a really, this whole series is the most important time for the female. Well, weaning is one of the most important times for the babies and one of the most stressful times. So that'll be our final series. When our whole program's over, we're really going to ask for you to help us out and let us know if this webinar, if it works for you, what other topics you might like to see us cover, how long you think they should be, what we can do to improve things, that sort of thing. So tonight it's going to be late gestation, basically that last 4 to 6 weeks that she's pregnant. And of course gestation varies considerably. Probably I'm going to say a range of 142 to 158 days. Sheep tend to be shorter than goats. I know my hair sheep will start pushing out babies at about 142 days. And there's a lot of different factors that affect the exact length of gestation. It's basically 5 months. But we're going to look at that last third of that last 4 to 6 weeks. And as I said before, really this is the most important time in the female's production cycle. You don't want to make mistakes here. So what's happening during this last 4 to 6 weeks of pregnancy? Of course, the first question I asked was, what percentage of fetal growth is occurring during the last 4 to 6 weeks? A lot, 70% or close to 70%. That's quite a bit. And so that's quite demanding on that female. The other ones that are still growing, we sometimes forget about them, but if you breed ewe lambs, which I do, and doe kids, which I did, so that their moms, by the time they're, say, 12 to 14 months of age, let's not forget that they're still growing too. So when we talk about feeding and managing them, they've got babies that are growing inside of them, but they're also still growing. Her udder tissue, her mammary tissue is developing. This is extremely important because not only must she give birth to healthy babies, but she needs to produce the food to take care of them. And then the one thing we never think about is her rumen capacity is decreasing. Babies take up a lot of room, especially if it's multiple births. The doe on the right was one of my Boer Nubian does, and she had triplets every year. And we can do things that we don't even realize that will further decrease her rumen capacity. If she's fat, internal fat, particularly with goats and hair sheep. If we feed low quality forage, she has to eat more so it takes up more space. So that's kind of what's going on that last third of pregnancy. So basically she needs more food. She needs more food to support the growth of the fetuses, to support the development of her mammary tissue, to prevent two very common diseases, pregnancy toxemia or ketosis, and milk fever, both caused by insufficient nutrients. We'll talk a little bit more about them as we go along. And to ensure that the babies that are born are strong and healthy and of moderate body weight. Birth weight is key to survival. Small babies have a lower survival. Big babies have a lower survival. You should never be proud of a female that delivers a 20-pound baby. You should be happy, but not proud, because that's too big. You want moderate-sized babies, and how big they are, I weigh my babies, how big they are depends on what species, sheep or goats, what breed, and how many are in the litter, whether the lamb is a male or female. Lots of different things factor into that. I've got some graphs in today's presentation, and I hope they don't confuse people, but rather I want them to illustrate some concepts. This first graph shows the nutritional requirements of a sheep. I chose a 176-pound ewe. This might be a Dorset type sheep or a crossbred type sheep, carrying or producing twins at different stages of her production. So maintenance, basically she's doing nothing, she's just kind of out there. Early gestation, which is basically that first 2/3 of pregnancy, and then late gestation, which is our focus tonight, and then lactation, early lactation. And obviously you can see from the graphs, as we go through each production cycle moving up to lactation, nutritional requirements just keep increasing. And where the biggest increase, if you'll notice under energy, dry matter intake is the total feed that we would balance a ration for. As fed is basically 90% of that, and that's the pounds of food that you'd actually give her. And then energy, or TDN, that's the primary nutrient we're usually concerned about. Big jump from early or mid-pregnancy to late pregnancy. Keep that in mind. Protein doesn't really increase until lactation. I don't know how well you can see the little numbers either, but animals require pounds or kilograms or grams of nutrients. They don't require percentages. But when we assume that they eat a certain amount of food, that's where the percentages come in. And what you need to understand here that is when you move to late pregnancy and then also to lactation, these animals need a more nutrient-dense diet. They need to eat more, sure, but they actually need to get more nutrition out of that diet as well, particularly in late pregnancy energy. So the second question that I asked was, what's the nutrient most likely to be deficient in late gestation diet of ewes and does? And it's energy, calories, food. Now that doesn't mean that we can't have other problems by not having enough of a certain mineral or vitamin or even be protein deficient in some environments. But for the most part, it's energy because those babies are growing and they need energy. Now how much you actually feed your sheep or goats is going to vary by sheep or goat, how old it is, how big it is. We've got folks with Finns and Icelandics. I assume we got folks with Suffolks and bigger sheep. We probably have folks with Nigerian dwarfs and Boer goats. So we've got quite a bit of differences in the size of these animals, and then also the number of fetuses that they're carrying. Again, I mentioned the llamas and alpacas being similar to sheep and goats, except they're usually almost always just carrying a single fetus, so their nutritional requirements aren't nearly as crucial as they are for sheep and goats. To meet these energy needs, very often we feed grain. And the reason we do that is because grain is a more concentrated source of energy. Hay can be good quality, silage can be good quality, but sometimes they simply can't eat enough to meet that higher need. And so we include grain in the ration because it's so nutrient dense. And if we're feeding a low quality forage, besides just the concept of grain to get more energy in them, we often need to supplement that ration with protein and or with calcium if we're feeding a really low quality forage. Now what happens if we underfeed our sheep and goats? And I want to include the fat ones too. Because the first thing I'll tell you is if a female is fat, late pregnancy is not the time to put her on a diet because she has babies inside her and those babies need nutrition. So if we underfeed sheep, including the fat ones, we're asking for a disease called pregnancy toxemia, also known as ketosis, lambing paralysis, twin lamb disease. It's caused by a deficiency of energy in the diet. What a ewe or doe will do is they'll need energy, so they'll break down the fat off their back. That'll produce toxic ketone bodies. That's where it gets its name as ketosis. So underfeeding, one of the biggest risks is pregnancy toxemia. When sheep or goats have that, obviously the quote cure or treatment is to get energy in them, glucose in them, usually propylene glycol. Orally, if you catch it early enough, in an IV if it's more advanced. Inadequate nutrition can lead to the birth of small birth weight babies. They're small enough, they may be weak, underdeveloped. You're going to have a higher mortality on these small babies. You're going to have less colostrum, and the colostrum's not going to be as good a quality. You're going to get less yield of milk. Remember, she doesn't just need to give birth to healthy offspring, she needs to take care of them and produce milk for them. If she's a dairy female, she may not be raising her babies, but obviously your income is derived from the amount of milk that she produces. For those of you raising fiber-producing animals, poor nutrition, not only in late pregnancy, but actually throughout pregnancy, can reduce the future wool production of those offspring by having fewer secondary follicles. So lots of impacts of underfeeding the pregnant female. Okay, let's flip to the other side. Don't love them so much that you feed them all they want. And again, I'm going to say including the thin ones. If an animal is thin, now is not the time to put her on a weight-gaining diet, because a lot of that nutrition will simply go into the fetuses and you'll get big babies. When you overfeed, that fat female is also very prone to pregnancy toxemia. Again, she's breaking down the fat on her back into toxic ketone bodies. An overfed fat female is likely to have more problems delivering her babies. We had a question in the chat about how do you recognize pregnancy toxemia. Well, both pregnancy toxemia and milk fever, which I'm also going to talk about, they look kind of the same. They go off feed, they're kind of lethargic and depressed, they may have problems with muscle coordination. Eventually they may become recumbent and not get up. Sometimes you'll even see kind of respiratory looking symptoms. The only way you can tell the difference between those two diseases, you can consider your feeding program and what might be the more likely cause, but it's how they respond to treatment. Propylene glycol for pregnancy toxemia and calcium for milk fever. I always assume any time a female is off or off feed in late pregnancy, it's pregnancy toxemia, and I drench her with propylene glycol. But if you do have one that shows the symptoms, besides worrying about the one that's showing the symptoms, you need to back up and look at the whole flock. If one's coming down with it, they all might be at risk. Back to the fat girls. They're more likely to have trouble pushing their babies out. Again, think of the capacity inside. She's full of babies, she's full of forage, and she's full of fat. Sometimes something's got to give. Sometimes she pushes her vagina out. She's so fat. Not that there aren't other contributing factors to dystocia and prolapses, because there are. In particular, vaginal prolapses have a genetic component, but overweight females have problems. That extra nutrition is going to go into those babies, and she may have a harder time delivering a large fetus. You may have to help her. And again, don't be proud of a female that delivers a 15 to 20 pound baby. You've put her through a lot. Very often the lamb may be born okay or seem okay, but he had a difficult birth, and you may not realize it. That's why I say both large babies and small babies are problematic. You want to be right in the middle somewhere. I'll tell you a little interesting sidebar about birth weights in babies. There certainly are management systems where nutrition's not at a real high level, and we have a problem with low birth weight babies. Well, they actually use sheep as a model to see the effect of Viagra on birth weight, because a lot of women in certain demographics have low birth weight babies. So when they use Viagra on the sheep, they also increase the size of their babies. Just a little sidebar. A couple more graphs to demonstrate what you need to feed your sheep and how it varies by certain factors. How does it vary by species or by genetic potential? When you look at maintaining a sheep or goat, it's actually a sheep is the most efficient, has a lower maintenance requirement, and a dairy goat has the highest maintenance requirement. But as you move through production, you see some changes. A sheep has more potential for milk than a meat goat, and for growth of those lambs than a meat goat. And a dairy animal has more potential than a meat animal, so you kind of see that reflected in these graphs. The real change in the nutrient requirements for dairy females, either sheep or goats, doesn't really kick into lactation. Basically, the same requirements exist for a meat sheep carrying triplets as a dairy sheep carrying triplets. It's if you look at, these are based on the National Research Council Nutrient Requirements that came out a couple of years ago, and there are no different requirements for the dairy female, one being milk commercially, than there is for your basic meat sheep or meat goat. And you look at lactation, because a dairy goat has the potential to produce more milk, her nutrient requirements are even higher. This is by making the female the same size. It's really the only way to compare them. 132-pound sheep might be small, but it's the only way to actually compare them. The other thing I want you to think about is, what size sheep do you have? One of the best, or goats, one of the best things you can do for yourself, for your nutritional program, is have your animals look alike, be alike. Be alike in terms of how big they are, their breed composition, and their productivity. Because nutritional requirements vary by all of those factors. So we've got folks in here with Finns and Icelandics, and we've got folks in here with bigger breeds of sheep. Same thing with goats, Nigerian dwarfs, and Boer goats. This chart shows you what you need for 3 different size ewes. And I suspect Finns and Icelandics may even be smaller than a 110-pound ewe. And a lot of Suffolks may be bigger than a 198-pound ewe. The thing you need to get out of this slide is, one, obviously a bigger animal needs to eat more. She needs to eat more. But basically the other thing we find out is when I get to a really big sheep, again, say I'm a Suffolk breeder, she needs to eat more, but at the same time, she's more efficient and she doesn't need as nutrient-dense a diet. We go from a 66% TDN, or energy composition, for our 2 smaller ewes, all the way down to 52% for our big ewe. Protein requirements don't change that much, just a little bit more, again, a little bit more efficient for that large female. Goats is different. Goats, where we see a difference is on the small size. We look at the 2 bigger does, 110 and 154-pound doe, and these are non-dairy. And I realize 154-pound does would be a pretty big doe unless she was awfully fat. But what you need to take away from this is, if you have Nigerian dwarfs or a real small breed, they need, yes, they eat less, but they need a really nutrient-dense diet. If you look at the percent energy, it needs to be 80%. Protein needs to be 15% compared to the other 2 types of does. So on the sheep, it's the big ewe that's more efficient, and on the goats, it's that small doe that needs a more concentrated diet. Age is a really big thing. Here we have a table that compares the nutrient requirements of a mature ewe, 176 pounds, again, say something like a crossbred or a Dorset, a big Katahdin, a small Suffolk, something like that. And then looking at ewe lambs. I breed the ewe lamb when she's 12 to 14 months of age. Looking at a couple of different size ewe lambs, and then looking at ewe lambs with twins versus a single. You can't compare them at the same weight because they're not going to be the same weight. When you start looking at the percentages, there's a big difference in the nutrient composition of the diet for the young female. She doesn't eat as much because she's smaller weight, but of what she eats, it needs to be more nutrient dense. And when I say more nutrient dense, that means that percent protein, or not protein, but percent energy has to be higher. And every feed has a percent TDN. A typical TDN value for hay would be about 55%. A typical TDN for a sack of feed would probably be about 72%. A typical TDN for corn would be about 90%. So when I say more nutrient dense, that young female, her diet needs to be composed more of probably have more grain or high quality nutrient dense feed as compared to the older females. Protein, it's not significantly different. Protein is about 10% regardless of the age of the female. Energy, I keep harping on energy in late pregnancy. This is where the differences exist. The next factor that really plays a big role is how many fetuses does she have? Again, this is what separates sheep and goats from llamas, alpacas, and cows, and horses. I think most of us are striving to have females, and I realize it varies by environment, but twin births. And in many cases, I know in my case, I actually would like to have 3 babies. I figure that's 3 times the money, and I have the nutritional resources to enable them to do that. So this is a 154-pound ewe, a little bit smaller ewe, say something like a Katahdin or a Cheviot or a Southdown, looking at the nutrient requirements based on the number of fetuses that she's carrying. When she's got just one, she's a cow or an alpaca, her nutritional requirements aren't that different, or they're significantly lower than the multiple births. The percent TDN is 53%, and if you remember I said hay, a good decent hay is about 55%. So what we're saying here is for the most part hay can meet her nutritional requirements even during late pregnancy. As we move up to the question about as fed. As fed is simply when we calculate rations and the nutrition that an animal needs, we do it on a dry matter basis. For example, you take hay and grain, they're typically 90% dry matter. Silage is like 35% dry matter. So in order to make everything equal, we do it on a dry matter basis. So when we convert it to as fed, that's the actual feed that you stick in the bucket or put in their feeder. And for the most part, on most of our feeds, hays and grains, it's just that dry matter divided by 90%. So it's just a little bit more. That's what I mean by as fed. As fed is actually what you feed. But when we actually look at talking about the numbers, we have to convert it to dry matter to be able to compare things on an equal basis. So that female carrying a single birth doesn't have real high nutrient requirements. We got significantly higher for the multiple births, the twins and triplets. Twins and triplets, they actually need the same density of nutrition, but the ewe carrying triplets needs to consume more feed. Protein, not significantly different. Again, in late pregnancy, energy is what we're talking about. In an ideal world, you would scan your ewes to determine the number of fetuses they're carrying. Well, these are carrying 1, these are carrying 2, and these are carrying 3, and you would feed them accordingly. Most of us don't do that. I know in my flock, rarely does a ewe have a single, so I'll feed for twins or better. Again, I'm going to say it pays to have animals that are similar, not only in their breed type and in their size, but also in their productivity. This is one you probably seldom think of. We were, at the beginning of the program, we were chatting with folks from different places in the country and in the world and talking about the weather. It's quite cold in a lot of places right now. It's even cold in Maryland. What we need to understand is, besides all the factors we just talked about, the weather, the environment can increase nutritional requirements, particularly energy, even higher. This graph gives an example of a goat that requires 2.8 pounds of energy. If I wanted to know how much hay that was, I'd divide it by 0.55, and that would tell me how much hay it needed to eat. Okay? What we need to understand is that if they're outside or it's really cold and it's really wet, when the temperature goes below their critical temperature, and their critical temperature, when it goes below that, they need additional nutrition to maintain their body heat, to maintain their body temperature. And so a goat has a higher critical temperature than a sheep. A shorn sheep, or a shorn sheep also has a higher critical temperature. A thin animal has a higher critical temperature, so you need to keep those things in mind. So if your sheep are housed versus pastured, pastured animals actually, all other things equal, are going to need more feed. So just keep in mind, and again, we're talking primarily energy here. But think of what your animals need, and then think, when you have circumstances where you may see some significant differences in environmental temperatures or dampness or things like that, they may actually need more feed. And the same thing goes with your dog. I know this time of the year I feed my guardian dogs more than I feed them in the summer because I know they need uh, more energy to maintain their body temperature. Other thing we often don't think of is if they drink cold water, they need more energy to warm that water to their body temperature. So if you have the ability to give them warmer water, or at least not as cold and frozen water, that's going to benefit them as well. What you should do if you have sheep and goats in late pregnancy, you should balance a ration to determine what and how much to feed. You should do all the number stuff. Or you should look at what you're feeding and see if it's meeting the nutritional requirements and then make adjustments if necessary. That's what you should do. That's not what most of us do. Most of us do what I call the ballpark feeding method. We feed based on general recommendations. And often that general recommendation is we give them all the hay they can eat. And then we give them some grain during late pregnancy. Anywhere from a half to a pound of grain per day. How much that amount should be is going to depend on that, again, that size of the ewe, an Icelandic versus a Suffolk, a goat versus a sheep, that sort of thing. Some influence on the quality of forage that you have as well. That's typically what we do. And if everything works out fine, it works. But if you have some problems or you think you have some problems, you kind of need to do the choice above and start really looking at the numbers and looking at whether you're actually meeting their requirements. There's a URL in the lower right corner. There's some spreadsheets and programs that can be used to balance rations. If you have goats, there's an online program from Langston University that you can balance rations online. If you have sheep, Montana State University, my alma mater, has a program that you can balance rations online. I've put a spreadsheet together where instead of balancing a least cost ration, you kind of put in what you're feeding, who you're feeding, what you're feeding, and you look to see if you're meeting or exceeding those recommendations, and then you kind of tweak the numbers to see what you want to do. So if you go to that URL, you'll find some of those resources. Feeding isn't just about how much you feed, it's also about how you do it. And one of the most important things is to make sure everybody can eat at the same time. Now, if you give them all the hay they can eat, that might not be as important. But if you're limit feeding, you definitely want to make sure they can all get around to the feeder at the same time. And if you have horned animals, you might need even more feeder space. If you've got some dominant females, you might even need some more feeder space above and beyond what's actually required. You should ideally, and I almost say definitely, feed pregnant ewe lambs and doelings separate from mature females. 2 reasons. As I mentioned, the young females are still growing. They have higher nutritional requirements. They need a more nutrient-dense ration. The other reason is often they have trouble competing for feeder space. They don't tend to be the dominant ones. So you want to make sure not only do they get higher nutrition, but they get ample opportunity to consume their fair share of feed. You should separate the males after the breeding season. A couple of reasons for this. One, he's done his job. He doesn't need the nutrition that a ewe is going to get during late pregnancy. He's going to get fat. Some of them are pretty aggressive, particularly when they're fighting for feed or for grain. So you should take him out. Sometimes it's okay to leave him in past the breeding season, but when you reach a certain point, you really ought to get him out of there if you can. And in most cases, you shouldn't feed on the ground. I can see an exception of feeding on frozen ground, but when we feed on the ground, that is one of the mechanisms by which we spread diseases, things like parasites, but more importantly, some of the abortion agents can be spread by feeding on the ground. So we want to feed in feeders if we can. There's been some questions in the chat area about the web stuff. I'll make sure all of that is available. Generally speaking, most everything that I can find in the world, I try to put on the sheepandgoat.com website. It's just a matter of figuring out the navigation. So if you were looking for a ration program, you would click on either do a search on the website, or you could go through the links, nutrition, etc. So I try to put everything up on that website. This webinar will be posted to that website as well. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation. I'll try to make all those resources available to you. I'm sure a few of you answered differently on what nutrient is most important, and I bet some of you were thinking about something maybe like selenium. Many of our soils are deficient in selenium. It may depend on where your geographic location is. Certainly here in Maryland, we're deficient in selenium, and what that means is the feeds then are deficient in selenium. So what's the problem with that? Someone asked the question real quick, soils in western Maryland, Allegheny County. Yeah, I believe they're deficient in selenium. The problems that we get from lack of selenium or vitamin E, which are very closely tied together, poor reproductive performance. That's a really generic term, and it's probably really hard to figure out that it was caused by a selenium deficiency. Same thing with retained placentas. Really hard. The one that's really easy to detect is white muscle disease. If you look at the pictures there, the hunched up lamb, and then you look in their muscle, the white in the muscle on the left, you can fairly easily determine that a lamb died of or suffered from white muscle disease. And that's an indication that you're having a problem with selenium. Selenium is passed from the placenta to the fetus during late gestation, so the nutritional status of the ewe or doe during late gestation affects that lamb or kid. So what do we do from a practical standpoint? Well, most of us feed free choice mineral mixes that have selenium in them, and I can honestly tell you for the most part that probably works for most of us. There's probably enough selenium in the feeds or hays that we give and the feeds, maybe a complete grain mix, and in the free choice mix. If you're having a problem or at higher risk, you should make sure they're getting their selenium, basically you force feed them through the grain ration. Free choice mineral mixes, they don't all necessarily eat what they're supposed to and get what they're supposed to. So when you're at a risk for something, you want to make sure it's actually in the ration that they have to consume. And then if that still doesn't work, on some operations they'll give injections to lambs and kids when they're born. Sometimes they're given to the pregnant female, but I can honestly tell you there's been some problems with that. Selenium, which you usually use through a product called BOSI, you must get that from a licensed veterinarian. You should use it under their recommendation. There are some oral supplements for selenium, but if you're actually treating a selenium deficiency or have a high risk for selenium deficiency, then you may be looking at the injections. What's important to note is that there's a very narrow range between what they need and what can be a toxicity, and that's why I say you have to be really careful. There's other products besides BOSI that contain different concentrations of selenium. You just need to be really careful, and I think that's probably why you have to get it through a veterinarian. A couple of questions about selenium. If a lamb survives white muscle disease, should extra be given to it later? I think once it's survived it, it should certainly have it in its ration, but I don't necessarily think if the symptoms are gone, if you need to continue with any injections. On the other hand, an injection is not necessarily going to hurt. There's probably, I've seen online maps of selenium deficiencies or where the soils are deficient in selenium, and if you email me at a later time, I'll probably be able to find that. And yes, you should be able to test for any type of mineral deficiency, blood test. The other mineral that might have come to mind when I asked that question is calcium. Basically, during late pregnancy, calcium requirements double. Calcium is a part of bone, calcium is a part of milk. One of the things we see, or the most direct cause, can be milk fever, which is basically low blood calcium. It's usually caused by an inadequate intake of calcium during that last 4 to 6 weeks of pregnancy. It can also be caused because she's been consuming enough calcium, but she can't mobilize it. She can't get it from her bones. Milk fever typically occurs in sheep and meat goats probably prior to parturition. In a dairy female, particularly cows, it can occur after. So you can't actually give them too much calcium. So I always tell people, if you have like really nice alfalfa hay, wait till lactation to feed that, because that's when she needs that really high nutrition, that really high protein, and save that legume for after. The ewe that you see in the picture is actually one of mine. She got milk fever, actually needed an IV injection of calcium, and the scenario that created this was the ewes were consuming grass hay. It wasn't the best grass hay. It was bought sight unseen. I had just moved up to where I live now. They had free choice minerals, which they were consuming, I thought, like gangbusters. Well, 2 sheep came down with symptoms, one quite severe, and obviously that free choice mineral wasn't getting the job done for those 2 ewes. The rest of them probably were. Well, after she received her IV calcium, and then I continued to give her calcium subcutaneously afterwards, after she responded, she delivered twin lambs and did just fine. I changed the ration so that they basically were force-fed the calcium through a grain ration. So you need to be careful. You never do the same thing. You can never say you feed the same every year, because hay changes every year. And our rations are usually based on forage, and then we feed supplements to fill in the holes. So always keep in mind that your hay and your grass change every year, and always be open to thinking, well, in what way might it have changed? What might they be deficient in? In this case, my hay was clearly deficient in calcium, and the free choice minerals clearly weren't getting the job done. Couple more graphs, again, just to illustrate their requirements for calcium and phosphorus during late pregnancy. This is for a 176-pound ewe carrying twins. Notice I always say twins. I just think if you're going to raise sheep and goats, unless your environmental forage conditions are really poor, I think twins or above should be the goal. But what I want you to notice here is the highest calcium requirements for a sheep are in late pregnancy. They actually decrease after lambing. Phosphorus requirements go up a little bit after lambing. So as further she goes along in the cycle, the requirements increase, calcium being highest in late pregnancy. Switch over to goats just a bit, because sometimes there are differences between sheep and goats, and I always want to make sure that I talk about those. One, quite interesting, the highest requirements for calcium in a goat, and I believe this was for a non-dairy goat, is highest in lactation. Her late gestation requirements aren't that significantly higher than during the rest of the pregnancy. Same with phosphorus. Phosphorus goes way up after lactation. So just a little bit different than sheep. So if you have both sheep and goats, always remind yourself that there are some little differences between the 2 species. Sometimes big differences, but very often there's subtle differences that you always need to keep in mind. Somebody had asked a question about feeding alfalfa pellets. The way I look at feeding any type of feed is I try to make a little bit of money on my sheep, and so obviously the first step is to meet their nutritional requirements, but I want to do it in the least cost way possible. So if alfalfa pellets, which tend to be pretty high in protein, say 18 to 20%, pretty high in calcium, if they're the most economical way to provide those nutrients, then yeah, I'd go ahead and feed those. So let's look at different feeds and talk about different feeds in terms of how much calcium they have. What's really important for you to know is that grain, and by grain I don't mean sack feed, I mean corn, barley, oats, milo, triticale, the basic grains, and even soybean meal. They're very low in calcium, high in phosphorus. That's why it's a problem when we feed straight grain, again, straight corn, barley, to a wether, because being high in phosphorus and low in calcium we're just asking for urinary calculi or kidney stones. Okay? When we talk about the pregnant female, we're not concerned about kidney stones, but we need to understand that if I'm feeding grains, soybean meal, or I'm mixing corn with soybean meal, they're not getting much calcium out of that. Conversely, our forages are much higher in calcium, especially legumes like alfalfa, lespedeza. A mixed hay is going to be intermediate. A grass hay is going to be better than grain, but not quite as high as a mixed or legume hay. Okay? So you need to know what your forage is providing to see if you need to supplement that late gestation and that lactation diet. One way to do it is to buy sack feed. Those are complete balanced rations, and they're going to have higher levels of calcium and phosphorus in it. You can also just add the ingredient or the nutrient that you need. You know, I need calcium, so I'm going to add just limestone. Sometimes people feed kelp just for what it adds to a single thing that they're looking for to add to the ration. corn, when you look at feeding, I want you to keep in mind, when we look at feeding ingredients, we're usually looking at a certain nutrient that we want to provide, and that no ingredient is a complete ration. Okay, so it's the combination that's the ration. Much like when we eat dinner. You know, I eat meat, potatoes, and a vegetable. I look at that's a whole ration. If I just eat one, it's not going to be balanced. And then the other thing to keep in mind, again, getting back to this forage quality, kind of like my scenario, if you're feeding a low-quality forage, grass hay, and not a good grass hay, you're probably going to have to add calcium to that late gestation ration. You're not going to be able to feed just hay and, say, corn or barley. You're going to need to get calcium in there. When I feed a grass hay in late pregnancy, and I often do because of economics, I actually end up mixing a feed ration that's higher in protein than I need, but it's the only way I can get the calcium high enough. Okay, we're going to divert a little bit away from nutrition because there's other things that are of concern in late pregnancy. Now, next week's session is going to be all about vaccinations. And I know a lot of folks are going to be joining us for that session. And so I'm not going to go into real detail here. There's a lot of stuff that you can vaccinate sheep and goats for, and it's going to vary by where you're at and what the diseases are prevalent. But I've done a lot of traveling around the world. Not everywhere in the world, but a lot of different places. And I can honestly tell you that I would universally recommend vaccinations for the clostridial diseases. They're bacterial diseases. Most of them are ubiquitous in our environment. It's about 10 different ones. The ones that affect sheep and goats are what we call overeating disease, which is type C and type D, and tetanus. So the vaccine we typically talk about, we call it CDT, the one that's pictured here. The recommendation is to vaccinate the pregnant mom, or upcoming mom, about a month before she's due to lamb. This way the babies will drink the colostrum, and they'll acquire passive immunity to those diseases. That immunity will be pretty complete for the first 4 weeks, and then as you go 4, 10, 12 weeks, it's going to start to decline, and then you'll vaccinate the babies. We'll talk about that in the next session. Vaccinating the dam is the only way to protect the lambs and kids from type C. That affects very young babies. It's also the only way to provide early immunity to tetanus. So say you're going to ban the males or ban the tails or even disbud, and you do that relatively young, they'll be protected. Otherwise, you're going to need to use the tetanus antitoxin. If a female's never been vaccinated before, or you just don't know, you're going to need to vaccinate her twice during late pregnancy. And you don't want to vaccinate within 2 weeks of her lambing or kidding because that's not enough time for that immunity to pass into the colostrum. Okay? Well, again, we're going to cover vaccinations in much greater detail in our next session. Anybody who knows me knows that the worms are like my favorite topic. In a climate like Maryland, there are a very significant health problem. What happens to the small ruminant female, sheep, goat, llama, or alpaca, is when they get close to lambing, and after they lamb, as you can see from this graph, they suffer a temporary loss of immunity. They have built up immunity to parasites with their age. And for whatever reason, hormonal, the stress of the babies on them, they suffer a loss of immunity, as indicated by fecal egg counts. They deposit more eggs in their feces. They have more adult worms in their systems. It's just a natural phenomenon. It doesn't occur in cattle. So what do we do about this phenomenon? The traditional response was, and still in many cases is still a good recommendation, is to deworm all your females prior to lambing and kidding. You could do this at the same time you gave the C, D, and T vaccine. You could do it 2 weeks prior to lambing and kidding. You could do it when they lamb and kid. Even a couple of weeks after is better than not doing it at all. Okay, so that was a common recommendation, and it's still a good recommendation if you have a flock or herd that's very susceptible to parasites. You're lambing and kidding at a time of the year like the spring when parasites are a significant problem. An alternative to this practice is to use some of the diagnostics that we have available to us nowadays to to see if an individual animal needs deworm versus deworming the entire herd. This comes from the idea that we've dewormed sheep and goats so much that the drugs have developed resistance, so now we want to kind of pinpoint the need. One way is to use the FAMACHA system. You see the card in the lower left corner. Basically, we're looking at the eye to see evidence of anemia, which is the primary symptom of the barber pole worm, which is the primary parasite in warm, moist climates like Maryland, maybe not in some of our other locations that are of people participating. We have a new system called the 5-point check, which is basically saying not only do you want to look at the FAMACHA or the eye color and the barber pole worm, but we need to evaluate the whole animal for all parasites. The other criteria would be body condition. In fact, I think body condition is a huge criteria of whether or not to deworm a pregnant female. What kind of body conditions she's in. What her hair coat looks like. Whether she's had any diarrhea. Things like that. Bottle jaw. Looking at the whole animal to see if they need treated. The other alternative is to increase the level of protein in the ration during late gestation. This is particularly going to work with the barber pole worm because it's a blood sucker. Sucks blood, the animal loses blood and protein. So by putting more protein in the ration, we're trying to counterbalance the effect of the barber pole worm. One thing I didn't mention, if you are deworming females, a common question I get is, it's safe to deworm a pregnant female. Well, all of the anthelmintics that are available in the U.S. and Canada, and I presume for the most part the rest of the world, for the most part, I'm going to say they are fine to give to pregnant females if you follow the label directions. The only exception would be valbazen and or albendazole, which is its name. If you read the label on that, during the first 30 days of pregnancy or 30 days after the removal of the male, you don't want to use this dewormer. It could cause abortions. We had a question about what is late gestation. About a month, 6 weeks before lambing and kidding. That's what we're referring to in late gestation. I'm a big advocate of feeding a Coccidia stat during the last month or so of pregnancy for a couple of reasons, but the primary reason being to reduce the number of Coccidia oocytes in the environment in which the lambs and kids will be born. Coccidia is a different type of parasite. It's a protozoan. It's single cell. It produces spores. When we give a Coccidia stat, we don't get rid of Coccidia. We just hinder their reproduction, reduce the number that are in the environment. So when the babies are born, they're still exposed to Coccidia, which is good because they need to be exposed to parasites in order to develop immunity, but they need to be exposed to low levels of parasites. And so by using a Coccidia stat, we're reducing the amount of oocytes in the environment. Want to continue that through weaning. Don't want to do it year-round. You're primarily doing it to benefit the kids and the lambs. A sheep, Bovatec is the product we have for sheep, Rumensin for goats, and Decox for either. The one important thing I want you to always keep in mind is definitely be careful. If you have equines on the farm, you need to absolutely make sure they can't access Rumensin and really any of the Coccidia stats I wouldn't want to risk. An added benefit of the Coccidia stats, particularly Rumensin, is it may prevent abortions caused by toxoplasmosis, which you notice I got a picture of a cute little kitten in here. Toxoplasmosis is Coccidia organism that affects cats. It's why you often are told if a woman is pregnant, she's told not to empty the litter box. And that's because of the risk of toxoplasmosis. Most of the infectious agents that cause abortion in sheep and goats also cause them in women. So you have to be careful. So it makes sense that a Coccidia stat would also affect the Coccidia kittens. I've looked at the chat a little bit and people were talking, made some mention of cats. It's okay to have cats on sheep and goat farms. The main thing you don't want is a constant population of new kittens. That's where your Coccidia is typically found. You want to maintain a healthy, vaccinated supply of cats for rodent control. You don't want to have lots of kittens being propagated. And certainly if you do, I would highly recommend feeding a Coccidia stat. Somebody asked a question about Corid, which is a treatment for coccidiosis. To my knowledge, it's not a problem with equines, but I would probably want to read the label to make sure. Another thing you can feed in late pregnancy if you have a history or risk of abortions. Particularly here we're talking about chlamydia, which is also called enzootic abortion, and also Vibrio, which is called Campylobacter bacteria. Antibiotics can prevent those types of abortions, and so you can include it in the feed. It is approved for sheep. You'd have to get veterinary approval for goats, and you can also give injections to try to prevent it. If you have an abortion storm, and what I mean by abortion storm is you have a lot of dead babies. And not like 1 out of a litter of 3 or 2 out of a litter of 3. It takes out the whole litter. Or the babies are born but they're not really very viable and they end up dying. If you think you're in an abortion storm, you should initiate giving injectable antibiotics. Typically we're talking LA200, which is oxytetracycline. You definitely want to get a veterinarian involved working with you. Any female that aborts, you want to isolate her. Ideally you want to submit some samples to a diagnostic lab to see if you can identify what's causing the abortions. You want to destroy everything so that you don't pass it on to other females, and you want to disinfect the pens. This is one of the worst things that can happen with sheep and goats, and you definitely want to get veterinarians, diagnostic labs to work with you because you can have substantial losses, particularly for a very big farm. If you have fiber-producing animals, an excellent management practice is to shear or crutch before lambing. And I've just got a whole bunch of reasons why it's good. It's, to me, even the best reason is you get cleaner fleeces. If you're in the fiber producing business, having clean fleeces is one of the most important things, but there's a lot of other management advantages. It's cleaner, healthier, drier. The baby's going to grab onto a teat and not a tag. Hey, you can put more sheep around a feeder. You can put more of them in a barn. If they're shorn, they're more likely to seek shelter. On the negative side, they're going to need more feed. They're going to need more shelter, particularly if it's the wintertime, because they're going to lose heat by not having a fleece on that. And crutching, if you don't know what that is, crutching is basically, instead of doing full shearing, you kind of shear around the important parts reproductively, around the udder, around the vulva, so that if you have to assist a ewe, it's nice and clean back there, and then the udder is clean again for that lamb and kid that's trying to latch onto a teat. So if you can't shear them, at least you should crutch them. And usually that's not very good quality fiber to begin with, and I think that'll also have some minor improvement of your fleeces. I'm winding down here. I apologize, I think I'm going a few minutes over. Getting stuff ready a couple of weeks, a week before you're due to have your first babies. You should write down when you put the male in. Some of you are going to have breeding dates. You might use a marking harness. You might hand mate dairy goats, things like that. Count back. I don't know. I'd probably start looking 138 days in case they're having problems, but get your stuff set up. And there's that really, we're talking about facilities, but also some of your supplies. We probably got folks that are going to lamb and kid in two kind of different ways. One, if you lamb and kid now, when the weather's pretty cold, more than likely you're doing it in some type of building, or they have access to some type of building. It needs to be clean, it needs to be dry, it needs to be draft-free. It doesn't need to be bedded with 3 feet of bedding, but it needs to provide a good environment for lambing and kidding. You should leave them alone, give them a big area. After they have their babies, it's very common to take mom and her babies and put them in a small pen. We call it a jug, but it's just a small pen. Mine are about 5 feet by 5 feet. They might be smaller if you have smaller animals, bigger if you have bigger animals. And you keep them in there I keep them in there for as short as a half day to maybe, say, 3 days. A rule of thumb used to be a day for each baby. If you see the ewe in the upper right, she lambed in March out on pasture, which was great. She made her mess out there, and then I still brought her in and put her in a jug. By having her in this small pen, you can observe. It facilitates bonding. I usually ear tag my lambs and weigh them, so it gives me easy access to them. If, on the other hand, I'm going to lamb later and on pasture, and I do that with some of my ewes, it's kind of the same philosophy as lambing in a building. It should be clean. The pasture should be well rested, particularly if we're talking about parasite larvae or spreading manure or something like that. We want them to be clean and well rested. They should have access to shelter. You know, it's going to be milder weather typically, but you should have access to shelter. And most people aren't going to pen them necessarily unless there's a problem. Maybe they had a yearling that wasn't mothering up with her baby, and they might, you know, they might put that one in a pen or give it some special attention. But in many cases, they're just going to let them lamb and kid naturally on pasture and just kind of keep an eye on them and catch them up if they need to ear tag them or castrate or dock them or that sort of thing. But the main thing is to be clean, dry, draft-free. And don't really restrict her movement until, you know, I think a common mistake beginners make is they often put them in the pen before they've lambed and kidded. You know, they're fine out in the bigger pen, let them make the mess out there, and then after they've had their babies, they can go in the small pen. And try not to keep them there very long. You know, a couple of days is about all they need unless they're having some major problems. What kind of supplies should you have on hand? This is just a list that I put together. I think I have just about everything on this list. Does it mean I use them or use them every year? Certainly not. But these are some things that you might need for routine things, but also for things that could go wrong. If you were to ask me what the most important thing on this list to have, I would say frozen colostrum, having colostrum. Okay, in case a ewe doesn't have colostrum, in case she doesn't have enough. The second thing I would say would be an esophageal feeding tube, in case the baby needs to be fed through the stomach. That would probably be the next most important thing. And there may be some other items on here that other folks could suggest in the chat box. But these are just some things that come to mind if certain problems occur. The calcium for milk fever, the propylene glycol for pregnancy toxemia, antibiotics for different things, retained placentas, something like that. The lube, the snare, the things like that if you have any problem, if you need to intervene with delivery. And in our third session on parturition, we're going to address some of the problems you might encounter. But these are just some of the things that I might suggest having on hand. Last slide is just kind of a do's and don'ts during late pregnancy. The one thing I want to say about late pregnancy versus, say, growing lambs and feeding lactating ewes that's different. A lot of times what we feed a lamb to grow and what we feed a ewe to produce milk depends on the level of production we want. You know, feeding them the most may produce the most milk and the most growth, but it is not always the most economical. So maximum's not always the best. When we talk about late gestation, it's not a minimum or a maximum. You just need to do what's right. Regardless of whether you're lambing in a barn, regardless of whether you're lambing on pasture, regardless of whether you're in Turkey or Canada, that ewe has a nutritional requirement to meet the needs of the growing fetuses inside of her. And if you don't meet it, you could have problems, and if you exceed it, you could have problems. It's very different than feeding lambs and feeding ewes for lactation. It's not just going to be lower performance. You could actually have problems if you over or underfeed. So you don't have you don't really have the flexibility. You need to kind of do what's right.